looks like it's 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started and let folks join on as they are able. So welcome to this webinar hosted by Organic Farmers Association. My name is Allie Lynn and I'm the Membership and Outreach Coordinator for OFA. The mission of Organic Farmers Association is to provide a strong and unified national voice for domestic certified organic producers. OFA aims to build and support a farmer-led national organic farmer movement and national policy platform. We're a membership organization, and you can join as a farmer member, a supporter member, or an organization. And we encourage all of you to be a part of this national movement. More information can be found on our website as well. Today, we're excited to have Patty Lavera, Organic Farmers Association's Policy Director, to speak about advocating for organic. The big question is, how can we get Congress to support organic farmers? Patty will share with us how to make your voice heard in the legislative process and how to lobby your elected officials, as well as how to get ready for meetings with your members of Congress, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or at home in their local district offices. Patty will cover how to schedule a meeting, what to bring, what to say, and how to create ongoing communication with elected officials. Patty joined Organic Farmers Association as our policy director in 2020. She brings an impressive background in grassroots organizing, on-farm and food policy issues, and lobbying in Washington, D.C., as well as an extensive knowledge of organic farm issues. Previously, Patty helped start and grow Food and Water Watch, otherwise referred to as FWW, serving as their Food and Water Program Director for 14 years. In her role, she represented FWW in the National Organic Coalition. Patty has her bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Before joining Food and Water Watch, Patty was the deputy director of the Energy and Environment program at Public Citizen and a researcher for the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. During Patty's presentation, we will have everyone muted. You are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A feature, and we will have time for Patty to answer all of those questions at the end. And now we will have Patty start her presentation.
Great. Hi, everybody. Happy you get on and you want to learn more about getting in touch with our policymakers and making sure they understand why we need them to focus on organic and what we need them to focus on. So just for a couple minutes in the beginning, I want to kind of put some context around the specific thing we're talking about today, which is how do we advocate to Congress? We could have other conversations as OFA and or individually. You know, there's a lot of planning that goes on to deciding what you're actually going to advocate about, right? And so this topic today is going to be about a specific activity, a specific tool in the toolkit of how we make change in government policy, which is going and talking to your elected officials, which is what lobbying is. But to back out of that just for a minute to make sure we're all starting with the same understanding, you know, we don't just haul off and go lobbying for the sake of it because it's fun or easy. We do it because we've done some other work to decide what we're going to ask, what our problem is, what the solution is, and fairly specifically what the solution is. Not, you know, we can go lobby on very broad asks like, you know, farmers should make more money, but it's going to be a more productive meeting if you have some suggestions of how and what that particular elected official can do to achieve that goal. And then you also, depending on what, you know, we've gotten together, we've decided this is the problem we want to solve, this is the solution, got to make sure you're hitting the right place, right? That the person you're talking to is who can give you what you want. So you have to know what you want, and then you have to know who can give it to you. And that sounds silly, but it actually is really common that people skip that step and they jump right into, oh, this guy seems powerful, let's go take this problem to them. And it might not be their territory, right? It might not be their something they can do, or they can use that as an excuse if you're not sure, and they give you the runaround and tell you to go talk to somebody else. So this is just an example, this slide, of like there's a lot of different levels of government, and it depends what you're trying to work on, who you should go talk to, right? So if it's a assessment issue of your farm and what your property tax is, that's probably not a federal issue. That's probably not Congress, right? That's somebody, the county level or something like that. If it's the roads, if it's a county road, that's going to be your county commission. It's probably not going to be Congress. Some things the state is doing, but a lot of things, especially as we think as organic farmers who are participating in this program that the USDA runs, Congress and the federal level is where a lot of our solutions are going to be, and that's where OFA is focused. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I do just like to put this up there to start with, to make sure we're all kind of thinking about this in the right way, which is that lobbying and this particular activity of going to have that meeting with a member of Congress, which is the example I'm going to use the rest of our time, makes sense in a plan that you've sorted out. This is not the entire plan. This is part of a plan. It's one particular tool. And legal things, again, I don't always recommend starting there, but there may be a point in time on the issue you're working on that you do have to go to court, and then you have to figure out, is it time, which level of court? There's homework to do there. At a different point in time, that might be the right tool in your toolkit, and ideally we're working together to make sure we have that plan and we understand where we are in that progression. So again, just one more thing to kind of put us in some context and keep in mind, the role of a lobbying or an advocacy visit. There's lots of ways you can try to influence an elected official. There's also ways you can try to influence folks who are appointed, right? They are appointed by the governor, or they're appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture to work at USDA. There's some similarities, but there's some differences because they're not running for election. But when you're talking about people who are running for election, so legislators in Congress, in your state legislature, your county or town board, because they are running for election, because their name is out there, because they have to be somewhat accountable to their constituents, we think about them in a particular set of ways about how we influence them, how we get them to know who we are and what we want. And this is kind of in the order of like how serious you're getting, how much work it takes. And they know this, right? So just calling is perfectly worth doing. I'm never going to say no if somebody wants to call their legislator and tell them what's up. If you've ever gone to one of these offices, the phones ring all day long and they have people there to sit and pick up the phone and if they're running a good office, they're keeping a tally, especially if it's a hot topic. There's something, a Supreme Court justice is being confirmed, or they're really like a big controversial issue, is they are literally keeping a tally sheet as those phones ring. They're trying to figure out if you are that person's constituent. You're not calling from across the country. And then they're going to be like, are you a yes or a no? And that is a way to let them know what's up. They also know that, lots of folks, and there's, I'm not casting any aspersions, lots of good groups do this. They also know that groups organize people to make the phones ring. So it is what it is. They track it. But I would say that's kind of an entry level way to communicate with elected officials. Similarly, sending some kind of mass email, right? Lots of people ask, oh, I get these petitions, right? They want me to sign this petition. Do they notice? I would say, yes, they notice, but they also know that it didn't take you tremendous amounts of effort to sign that petition, right? So again, they kind of put that in that context of, all right, this was a big one. A lot of people wrote in, but they know where this falls on that ladder of like how much effort it took. And it's worth something by itself, probably not going to seal the deal if it's a controversial issue. Kind of going up the ladder in terms of it takes more work. So they weigh it a little heavier. They monitor, whatever level of government we're talking about. Elected officials look for their name in the paper. And so if there is a letter to the editor about them, good or bad, or an editorial, or an opinion piece, a column saying this problem is happening and Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so needs to vote the right way or needs to step up or needs to change their position, they are looking for their name. That's somebody's job in their office. And it takes more effort to get that place, so they notice that. Personalized letters I put around this level because they know the difference between a letter you write about your experience as their constituent that you've crafted yourself, as opposed to like clicking the button to sign a petition. And then that takes us to what we're going to talk about today, which is making the effort to go in there and talk to them. It does matter because they know that not everybody bothers to do it or can do it. So, I'm not going to say that a personal visit wins the day every time, but it does register that people took the time and effort to come in and talk to them, especially if you come all the way to DC. And then finally, there's lots of other things you can do, and OFA would have that conversation if we decided it was time. There's lots of other things people do to get the attention of elected officials, like showing up at their town halls or having a press conference or a rally. And, that hasn't necessarily always been something the organic community does, but that is on the, kind of the ladder of things it takes a lot of effort to do. They notice that stuff too, because that stuff doesn't organize itself. So again, we're, for OFA and organic, we're usually thinking about Congress. And for this webinar today, we're talking about what is the most effective way to do that personal visit, whether it's coming to Washington, D.C., like some of us are going to do in a couple of weeks for OFA's Advocacy Day, and we'll talk about how to do this. You can also try to meet with their staff in their district office at home, which is sometimes a more logistically feasible way to do it. So let's get in there and figure out how to do these meetings. So that's kind of why we do them. The plan we have, the bigger plan. We've figured out what we want. We have our goals, and we know the right offices and the right parts of the government to give it to us. So if we're at that point where we're going to use the tool in our toolkit of doing meetings with our members of Congress, there's just some mechanics about how you do it. So we're going to go through that. To give you some rules of thumb. They don't make it obvious a lot of times, but it's not that hard once you kind of know some of the tricks. So the first thing you got to do is figure out who you need to go talk to. There are structures in any legislature. If we're talking about Congress, there are committees, right? So for OFA and organic farmers, we are often talking about the agriculture committees. So there's a House Agriculture Committee, there's a Senate Agriculture Committee, and the next most common one you'll probably hear me talk about is the Appropriations Committee. So appropriations is a fancy word to intimidate people with jargon for giving government agencies their money, right? So if you remember your civics lesson, we have the legislative branch, that's Congress. You have the executive branch, that's the president. The president is in charge of all of these agencies, the Department of Agriculture, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. Those are the executive branch. The president is in charge of how they run, but Congress gives them their money through this process called the appropriations process, and they do it every year. I am not going to bore you with all the ins and outs of that process, but it is something that we pay attention to when we want specific things to happen or maybe not to happen inside an agency like USDA. So we watch that process. And so there's a committee where a lot of those decisions are made before you get to the final step of passing a bill on the House floor. A lot of the action is in that committee. So later on, when I'm talking about, who are your members of Congress, what committees are they on? That's one of the ones you'll hear us talk about. Like, we really like it if we have somebody who's member of Congress is on an appropriations committee or an agriculture committee. So we will also go meet with those committees. They have staff. And that's something that, as the policy director for OFA, when we work together on this lobby day, we figure that part out. But at the most basic level, when we want people to advocate for organic in Congress, we want them to go to their members, wherever you live. You have 2 senators and a representative, unless like me, you live in Washington, D.C., but that's a different webinar too. Everybody else has 3 members of Congress, the 2 senators and a representative. And there are very few instances where I'm going to tell you not to hit those 3 if you're coming to DC and you want to do organic stuff. Doesn't matter if they're not on the ag committee, they're not an appropriator. We need them to understand, 1, that they have organic farmers in their district, 2, that they should care about it. And we will talk about how you make them care about it and make that connection, because eventually we will be on the floor of either the House or Senate and they will have to vote for something. And we want them to at least be aware of the basics of organics so we don't have a problem at that stage. So the first thing you're going to do is figure out who are your members of Congress. The internet has helped a lot with this. But if you're not on the internet, you're probably not on this webinar. If you don't want to use the internet for it, you can call the congressional switchboard there. That's the number. And if you put in your zip code on the buttons, that will direct you to the offices. The easiest way to do it, because the staff does change, so even if you did it 3 or 4 years ago, it probably isn't the same person you met with who covers agriculture in that office. So the easiest thing to do is call that front desk for your member of the House, the representative, or your 2 senators. You do it 3 times. Ask, who's your staffer that covers agriculture. Make sure you get their name and their email address. They will connect you. They'll patch you through to that person's desk, but get the information, write it down, because odds are they're not going to pick up. They're probably in a meeting. So you can leave a voicemail for them when they patch you through. But if you've gotten their name and their email, you can also send them an email. And that, and you send them you don't need to write them a 9-page letter, but you need to say who you are. You're a constituent, you're going to be in town on these days, you would love to meet to talk about issues pertaining to organic agriculture. It doesn't have to be a huge long explanation, but a little detail. 1, helps them know you're legit and you're worth meeting with, and 2, that they're the right person for you to meet with. Because if you said, I'm really, really, really want to talk to you about this environmental regulation, they might get somebody else in the office who covers that as opposed to them. So you don't have to go bananas, but a little bit of detail will help you have a better meeting and meet with the right person. So similarly, if you're not coming to DC, it's a big deal to come to DC. We know that. It's a big trip for a lot of folks. I am here and I do a lot of meetings for OFA because I'm here, but in terms of organic farmers having these meetings, we know it's a heavy lift to ask. So we just don't want to forget the other option, which is to meet with the legislators' staff in their district offices. So this is 2 examples. I was just doing something with Wisconsin, so I used Wisconsin examples. So these orange offices, Washington, D.C., Beloit, Madison. I believe this is from Representative Pocan in the House from Madison in Wisconsin. So he has a couple regional offices. You could look there and call them and ask to, who can I meet with in the district office to come in and talk about organic agriculture. Some of them, if they call it a satellite office, like this one's only open certain times, that means it's not full time. The one in Madison is more full time. And at the end, I'll show you an example. The Congress takes a lot of breaks. They go home, usually at least 1 week a month. And in the summer, they're there a lot more. During that time frame, you have a better chance of meeting with the actual member of Congress during a recess in district than you do if you come to DC. Because when you come to DC, they're busy, they're voting, they're going to hearings. It's very hard to get an actual meeting with the member. In DC, it's not easy in the district, but it's easier. And this bottom one is just an example of a Senate, because she's covering the whole state. This was from Senator Baldwin's website. She's got more offices just because she's a senator. She's covering the whole state. So there might be one, that makes more sense geographically. So you call, same idea, you call there and you say, who can I meet with? This is what I want to talk about, and figure out if that's a better option. So you get your meetings set. You should always confirm them. Just make sure, usually you go back and forth a couple times on email to find a time that works. Make sure you confirm it. Make sure you know where you're going, where their office is. And then a lot of people stop there. And they're like, I got this meeting. I'm just going to go in. I know what I'm doing. I'm ready. I have thoughts, right? I know what I want. I know what I'm mad about. And yeah, you do. And that is the extent of kind of, you don't need to do policy research to get ready. You don't need to become some legal expert and do a ton of charts and graphs and data, but you do need to have a plan. And the reason you need to have a plan is that these are shockingly short conversations a lot of times, especially in DC, but it can happen in the district as well. These are busy offices. They do a lot of stuff. And you have to be efficient with your time, and you have to be efficient with their time, because they will not hesitate to end a meeting. If they got to go, they'll go. And if you're not done, you're not done. So it pays to really prepare kind of what your plan is for the conversation, how you're going to get everything done in a pretty compact period of time. And if you're going with a group, who is going to start, who's going to go next, and how do you make sure that you're not having these awful gaps where no one talks, or when everybody talks, right? So you really do need to come up with a plan. To help you come up with that plan, it helps to know who you're meeting with. Odds are, the vast majority of the time, you are meeting with a staff person. You are meeting with there's a lot of different job titles. I'm not going to go through them. There's a whole pecking order of like what people do in these offices. The Legislative director would be among the higher folks you meet with. They're kind of keeping an eye on everything and like keeping an eye on the whole package of like, this is this senator's position on all these issues. Somebody called a legislative assistant tends to be more entry level, but they do have responsibility. So odds are you're going to be meeting with a staff person. Occasionally they can work it out that you're meeting with the member of Congress. Even if you have that planned, that can change at the drop of a hat. They change the schedule for going to the floor to vote. Something happens, so even if you're planning to meet with the senator or the representative themselves, very high odds you might end up meeting with them for a minute, they leave, and then you're talking to the staff person. So don't be offended if you're talking to a staff person, and don't kind of phone it in because you think it doesn't count, because it does. And in most offices, that is who you're dealing with most of the time. I do always joke, I don't know who I'm talking to on the webinar, I can't see everybody, but in most rooms, especially in rooms full of farmers, these staffers are going to be way younger than you. They're going to be way younger than you think they should be. And that is the way that it is. So don't get hung up on, oh, we're just killing time until the grown-ups arrive. That's probably who you're talking to. They tend to be young. People are spending less time on the Hill before they leave to do something else. So that's the nature of the beast. You are perfectly in line to chit chat for a minute, and we're going to talk about this in a little while, for a minute to find out how long they've been there. Do they come from a farm background? If they're covering agriculture issues, you can do a little small talk and maybe suss it out, like how much they know. But if you're sitting there thinking, oh, this is just, the intern and I'm waiting for the grown-ups to arrive, that may not be a good assumption. That may be who you're talking to, because it's just a pretty young place. In terms of what to expect, the best thing you can do is just be flexible and be ready to roll with it, because, and we're going to get there, you're going to have a plan, and you can do that plan whether you are in a really nice meeting room with a closed door and it's quiet and you really can get comfortable, or whether you're meeting on 2 couches in the reception area of this office because all the meeting rooms are booked, or whether you're meeting in the hallway. That does happen, and it's not ideal. Ideally, they have a better system in their offices, but they get crowded, they get busy, and especially times like when in a couple weeks when OFA comes to town, lots of groups are going to come to town. It's a good week to do a fly-in, as we call it. There's certain weeks that make sense, so it will be busy and they will have a lot of meetings, and you kind of have to roll with it. And then the biggest thing to say before we move on in terms of what to expect is you should expect it to be pretty short. It's unfair how short some of these meetings are, but that is what's normal. So it is very normal to have a meeting last 20 minutes. If you get half an hour, that's not unheard of to get half an hour. Going an hour is amazing, right? They're just very busy. They have a lot to do, and they probably have another meeting booked at that half-hour mark. So you should be able to kind of cover what you want to cover in 15 to 20 minutes. And then hopefully you have enough engagement and enough back and forth conversation that you go over 20 minutes, you get to 30 minutes, but you should be able to cover what you need to do in 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so that you don't get cut off. So I think I have another slide in a second about researching your member of Congress and coming up with a meeting plan, but these are the 2 things we want to do before you get there. It's not in that 20 minutes, you don't have a lot of time to be hearing stories about what this member of Congress thinks, or how what they did before they came to office, or what their approach to liking regulations or hating regulations is. That's the kind of stuff we can get a feel for before you go in, because in those 15-20 minutes you don't have time for that kind of get to know you. You kind of need to know who you're walking into so you can make the best pitch. So in terms of doing that research, lots of this can be done online. For folks who are coming for the next OFA fly-in, we were just talking this morning, we're going to have some little profiles of the people they're going to meet with. There are services out there that write those up, but you got to pay for them. But you can do the basics by yourself on the internet. And I'm not saying people have to spend hours per meeting. You could do a couple minutes for each person you're going to meet with, and just have a little comfort level of what you're walking into. So the basics: Democrat, Republican, Independent. What did they do? Were they a lawyer? Were they a scientist? Were they a farmer? There's a couple of them. Are they freshmen? Are they new? It's their first term, or have they been there for 35 years? And they know how this place works, and they have a lot of seniority. That you can get that very quickly on the internet. If you go to, each member of Congress has a website. So there's an address there for the House. They have a very easy system for getting direct to the members' websites. In the Senate, and then that site has profiles. In the Senate, you go, basically, there's a directory of all senators. You go to senate.gov, and then you go to somebody's individual website, and most of them have a setup where they have a bio section. And, it's cherry picked. It's what they want you to know about them, but it's enough. They'll tell you that basic stuff. This is not mandatory, but it's sometimes illuminating. If you want to know who gives them money, because money makes our political system go around, the most reliable website I find for that is the site opensecrets.org. You don't have to do this, and it's not necessarily something you want to mention during the meeting, but if their top donor is, Dow or Bayer Monsanto, it's useful to know when you're going in to talk about organic farming, right? Like, don't make yourself crazy. You don't have to do this. But if you want to get an inkling of what makes them tick, who gives them money sometimes makes them tick. Especially if you're worried, if you think it's a meeting where they're not going to be super open to organic, maybe go take a look and just so you know kind of what you're walking into. And then in terms of the plan for the meeting with that 15 or 20 minutes, I'm assuming that you may not be by yourself, that you're going to be with a couple of people. Either way, you introduce yourself, you make sure everybody there introduces themselves. If it's a big group, you keep that pretty short because you don't want to take 5 of your 15 minutes saying hello. If you do have a minute and it doesn't feel super tight for time, it is kind of nice especially if this is the first time you've met this staff person, to say, oh, hey, what other issues do you cover? Because they might also cover appropriations, or they might also cover trade, or they might also cover environment, something else that overlaps. And it gives you a sense of kind of, and it's also politely, it's fair to ask, have you been here a long time? You've been doing this for a long time. Again, don't burn 10 of your 20 minutes getting to know the staffer's personal history, but a minute or two is nice. And for organic in particular, something I like to do, especially, and this is a judgment call, you don't have to do it, and you don't want to do it in like a judgy way. It is kind of nice to be like, hey, are you familiar with how USDA organic works? It's a very particular system, right? We have really particular standards and rules. There's a lot of structure to this. We all know it because we're in it, right? Y'all are being certified, you're living it. But lots of folks, or even Hill staffers who cover agriculture, are still a little confused about what that seal actually means, right? What this alphabet soup of acronyms, the NOSB makes recommendations, and then the NOP writes the regs. And you don't have to spend, again, you don't want to spend 10 minutes of your 20 minutes defining all those terms, but if it's helpful, it might be worth a minute, right? To be like, I'm an organic farmer. That means I have a organic system plan. I'm following a set of standards. I get inspected every year by a certifier. USDA has oversight over those certifiers. Something called the National Organic Standards Board makes recommendations, and then USDA turns those recommendations into rules that I follow. There's a lot of moving parts, but we're here to talk to you about making sure those moving parts are as strong as they can be. Because when you get into what we're going to get to next, which is our asks, you're probably going to talk about some of those moving parts. And if they don't understand even the basics of how they fit together, it's not going to be the best conversation. So that's a choice you make in the moment. If you want to spend a minute or two on that, I think for organic, it's worth politely, you don't want to insult their experience or their intelligence, but politely feeling them out to be like, because they might be like, I got it. I've been doing ag policy for 10 years. I was an intern on a farm. I know how it works. Great, you can skip that step. But if they're like, I think I do, think about what is your 1 minute explanation of like USDA organic. It's the only label that's like this. We have all of this structure behind it. And then again, you don't want to burn all your time doing that, but you do want to make sure they're starting in an okay place to understand your next point. So your next point is why you're here today, right? I'm here. I come from your district. I am farming, or I work for this group that represents farmers, and we're here today to talk about these things. I'm not going to get into all that today. I want this to be kind of like evergreen for how you do any lobby meeting. We will do that for folks coming to DC. We're going to do that the day before. We're going to go through our list of priorities for this point in time in 2020, and we will practice them. right? And so and in certain offices, certain things make more sense. And we will talk about that as well. That's part of your pre-meeting planning. But the other point I want to emphasize is if you put yourself in the shoes of these staffers, if they're meeting with you that day and it's a day they're doing a lot of meetings, they could meet with 10 people that day. That's not crazy. So you have to do something to just not be another person sitting across from them reciting talking points with a statistic or two. We have statistics, we're going to give them to you. You should bring a few key facts for each of the things we're asking them. But what they remember, and I hear this again and again and again, is a story or an example, one of a real life person, right? A real life family or person or farm. And ideally, that story is from their area, right? Their congressional district, the whole state, if they're a senator, because they can personalize that. One, it's more memorable, and two, they need those examples. So think about any time you have seen a politician of any type speak. Every time you're going to see them talk about some person, right? And I always joke with my fellow lobbyists that these people are probably made up, or it's an amalgam of people, right? But it's usually a school teacher who's married to a cop. One of them is a veteran. They have a child that goes to public school and needs certain things, and whatever bill that the congressman is there to introduce that day is going to help that family, who they name, right? And so I'm being facetious, but it is something that politicians do, and we want to be their stories about why they voted for more organic research, or they voted for enough money for the organic program to actually enforce these standards because such and such farm in my district is being hurt and my vote helps them. So they don't come up with those stories on their own. They get those stories from people giving them to them. So we want them to be using our stories to justify voting the way we want them to vote. So the last point on here, and this is kind of in the category of what to bring, it is nice to leave something behind because they do see a lot of people. It blurs together. This will happen to you if you do 4 or 5 or 6 meetings in a day. By the end of the day, you're going to be like, which one was that? So imagine being that staffer that does that day after day. So it is nice to leave something behind. We will have that for folks next month who come. We'll have handouts that have our priorities, have some key statistics in there, have contact information. And so OFA, if we're talking about lobbying for OFA, we will have those handouts for you, but it's nice to bring anything else if you have it. If you have cards for yourself, business cards for your farm or for yourself, that's ideal. If you don't sweat it. Maybe you have a brochure or a flyer for your farm or your CSA, depending on what you're doing. Just having the OFA stuff is perfectly fine. But if you have something else that is, not bulky, like 1 page or less, not expensive to you, you can afford to give a bunch of them away. If you have something, bring it, because it's just something to leave in their hands and then be like, I remember a couple of weeks ago, there was somebody in here and they were talking about organic, like maybe they can dig it out and get back in touch with you. That's the goal of leaving those handouts behind. So a couple more things, and then I'll shut up and we can do questions. A couple other points, and again, this sounds silly, but it's worth talking about for a minute. I am a firm believer that if you are going in to have one of these meetings, you're there for a reason, right? And it could be to get to know them because you want to build a long relationship, which we do. And, we're not going to solve all of our problems in 1 year with one farm bill or one budget. We know that we're in this for the long haul and we need to build those relationships and that these offices use us as a resource. That's all true. But it is rare that I, as a lobbyist, I'm going in where I'm not asking them something, right? I don't have something, and it might be kind of made up just to have a meeting and remind them I exist and remember us and you need to talk to us. But it's pretty rare to not have something you can articulate as an ask. It could happen. It could be a get to know you meeting, but for us, for OFA, especially now, we got stuff we want. We have asks, and that's what we will work on the day before our visits. We will hone that down to the 3 or 4 things we want these offices to do, and some of this depends on what happens between now and the middle of March, we'll know more about, we want you to put this amount of money in the budget for USDA. We want you to take this action to make sure USDA finishes rulemaking on these issues. Like, we will have asks for you, and that's because the ask is important. A lot of people kind of assume, because they're being too nice and they're being too charitable to the person they're meeting with, that they understood what I needed. I told them my problem and they understood. So I think they're going to get on it. You need to ask them, and you need to ask them explicitly, will you or your boss, your senator or representative, will they support this provision in the upcoming thing? Will they increase the budget for USDA? Will they, join with other offices and write a letter to USDA to say, why did you do that? Or why did you not do that? Our ask sometimes has been as simple as, in the House, will you join the Organic Caucus? But it's nice to ask them something, to know that this wasn't just a social call. And this wasn't just us learning to be friends. We need things from them, and it's okay to ask them. The other thing, and again, this sounds so silly, but you need to say it, not just assume they heard it from the subtext of your lovely talk. And then you need to let them answer. Because it's very common that people kind of wait too long. A lot of people aren't comfortable making an ask, right? It takes a little bit of self-confidence to be like, all right, I'm going to ask them this, right? And they might say no, and that's okay. And then you got to give them a minute to answer, because a lot of people wait, they procrastinate, they're running out of time in the meeting, and they're literally asking as they're packing up, standing up, putting on their coat and walking out the door. And that's not an ask. An ask is a moment in the meeting where you ask them, will you do this thing? And then you got to wait and let them answer, which is also very uncomfortable. We're often not, I think especially women sometimes are afraid to be pushy. You don't have to yell at them, you don't have to bang on the table, but you can politely state your request and see what they say. And then you see what they say, right? Then you look for an answer. So sometimes it's easy, right? And that's great. And sometimes you can ask them a couple things, and if you have an easy one, you start with that and you warm them up. So if you're like, hey, is your boss interested in joining the Organic Caucus, which just means like an interest group, and they kind of signal they like this topic by joining the caucus, that might be an easy ask. And I'd be like, you know what, that sounds like something we could do. I think we could do that. Great. Thank them. Think and be like, let us know if you need help doing that. We'll follow up and make sure it happens. That's fantastic. And that third bullet, move from supporter to champion, that's something we're going to talk about after the meeting. If we've asked them something that was kind of a first step, they did it, that's great. We're very greedy. Now, what can we ask them to do even more? How do I move them from what I would call a supporter, who's like, yeah, we ask them things and they do what we ask, to being a champion, which is like they come up with their own ideas. They get out there and fight harder, and they introduce bills, not just vote to support them. So that third bullet is what we're going to do later after the meetings if we got a yes. You could get a no, right? They could oppose you. And so let's figure out why, right? It could be because you're in an office that just doesn't like organic, or they just don't like government. And they're like, why is the government involved? This happens sometimes on organic cost share, right? There are some Republicans who just can't wrap their brain and their ideology around, one particular type of farmer getting this support. We can have another webinar about the hypocrisy that represents when lots of other types of conventional farming get support, but you will hear that. And so you got to ask, you go in, they're your member, you made the ask, you may have known what the answer is going to be. They give you the answer, it was no. Don't start screaming at them. Don't start calling them names. You can say, all right, thank you, appreciate knowing that. And then, if you thank them for your time, don't waste yours. If this is somebody that we're probably never going to get because of their ideology or because they are just bought and paid for by, big chemical agriculture, we went in, we checked in, we did it in the least amount of time possible, and, you get out of there. And so assuming there might be a scenario sometime in life where you can be uncordial and unfriendly, but you should stay cordial and friendly most of the time. We might be back in there someday for something else, but you don't have to waste your time if we're not going to get them. What is most likely to happen is this third category of undecided. You don't really get an answer. Sometimes you don't get an answer because you are talking to a staffer and they don't have permission to answer. They need to go check, right? They need to check with the legislative director or the member themselves, and they might be like, it sounds good, but I'll have to check. So that's a reason to follow up. Sometimes you get an undecided because they don't know what they think yet. And so there's a difference between, the two different reasons you might get I don't know. You might get an I don't know because they just have to go get an answer, or you might get an I don't know just because they're scoping out the scene and they're not sure who all the sides are in this debate and who they're going to side with. If that's the case, we're going to have a conversation afterwards about, well, what did they mention? What kind of questions did they ask? Did they say, I really need to see how this impacts growers in my state specifically? Did they ask about, I understand you want this as an organic farmer, but what about labor? What do they think? Take notes in that conversation for hints of who they might need to hear from besides us to get them to do what we want. So this is why, and then we're going to move to a close here. This is why we track these conversations. Take notes. It's okay to take notes. You don't have to wait till the end. A lot of people think it's rude to take notes. No, it's fine to take notes during it. They're taking notes, I hope, when they're talking to you. For when everybody's together next month, we're going to give you little worksheets. You don't have to do it during the meeting. Some people find that distracting, but right after the meeting, go out in the hall and jot down the answers to the questions we ask on that worksheet, which is these kind of questions. You know, did they answer you? Did it seem like there was another argument that would help? Can we follow up with some information? And in terms of tone of these meetings, as a rule, 99% of the time, I'm going to say, keep it together. Keep it professional. You don't need to burn every bridge on the way out the room. Maybe once in a blue moon, it's time to burn a bridge and yell at them. But as a rule, my advice to you is not to do that. Definitely don't start whining about, why don't you help us? They don't like that. Don't threaten them, especially if you can't pull it off. Don't be like, I'm going to unelect you because you won't vote my way if you don't have the power to unelect them. And whatever you do not write checks that you cannot cash in terms of, oh, I know there's 15 examples in our county of this happening. If you don't know that there's 15 examples, it is perfectly okay to say, you know what, I don't know. And that's actually an excuse to go home or go after the meeting, figure out the answer and get back to them. I will always say I don't know, than to take a guess and then find out what you guessed was wrong and you have to walk it back. They don't like that, because if they use that information with their boss and they had to walk it back, they're going to be in trouble and they're going to remember that you gave them bad info. So if you don't know the answer to something, it's okay to say you don't know, but you'll find out and you'll get back to them. So this is kind of to wrap up, and then we'll do some questions. What we do afterwards. So like I was saying earlier, these meetings are not a one-off thing. We have a meeting and then we win. These meetings are part of a bigger plan. And so it's important that we keep those notes during the meetings. We figure out what happened. If we ask them 3 things, my 2 senators, 2 of them said yes to all of them. The member of the House didn't. Is there follow-up we need to do? They were really interested in this. I mentioned this story about, all the organic farms in our area fared better in the floods because their soil health is higher. And, I said I have some pictures and I'm going to send them pictures, or some specific question. Just, keep those notes about things we can do, and follow-up is important. We do that follow-up. Even unless it was the worst meeting ever, you should send a thank you note, which could be quick. Could just be, hey, thank you for meeting with me. This is my contact information. Please stay in touch. And if there was anything, you're not going to answer this question, we talked about this. Here's an interesting article about it. You can include that follow-up. One thing that comes up is people want to know how often and like what level of familiarity to follow up with. You should follow up within a week of having the meeting. If after that they seemed interested and something interesting happens, there's a new development on something you talked about, it is totally appropriate for you to be in touch with them. You don't have to wait another year before you come back to DC. Having said that, don't become a stalker. Don't become someone who emails them every morning and sends them news clips they don't have time to read. Like, use some discretion. These are busy people. They get a lot of communication from all sides. So if you're we do want to periodically touch base with them and remind them we exist, but you also don't want to become a nuisance. So you kind of have to use your judgment on that. And then this last part of planning next steps is what we do together as OFA. What does this mean for our strategy, right? So we're going to take those reports you make, we're going to look at them and be like, oh, that's interesting. This office has never been receptive before on organic imports and why we need NOP to do better enforcement, right? But that's the first time they seem to have bitten on that. Maybe that's a follow-up meeting that Patty can do, right? To make sure we don't lose that momentum. Or so-and-so really was interested in this piece of appropriations, we'll get them that info. And then we want to think about if certain offices are kind of rising to the top, which happens, of, yeah, they supported our stuff. Maybe they can do more for us. Like I was talking about earlier, maybe they can be more of a champion. How do we move that along? Maybe this is a great office to think about inviting them out to a field day, to visit the farm, to the farmer's market, something. They love getting their picture taken. If they're on the ag committee or they have any farmer members, they love getting their pictures taken on farms. So think about, are there things we can do rather than waiting till next spring when you're back for another fly-in? how do we keep in touch with them? And that's something that we can talk about, with as OFA, about who we want to prioritize and brainstorm those ideas. So this is just the last thing to remind folks. So the red, this is for the Senate. It's very comparable for the House. So they do work sometimes, like in June. The red is when they're in DC working, but there's a lot of months on there where they're home 1 week a month. In the summer, they're home a lot. In October, they're home a lot because of the elections. So that is where that in-district meeting is an option to think about. You can do an in-district meeting anytime. They do have staff there, but you will run into more staff from DC going out to the district during a recess, or the member themselves being in that district office during those recesses. So you don't have to memorize this. This is something you can look up, but this is kind of just for inspiration to think about things to do in between DC fly-ins. Meeting them on their own home turf is a really good thing to do. If you want to invite them to something, there's ways to do it on the websites usually, or you can just call that DC office and ask for the scheduler. Every office has somebody whose job it is to schedule their member going places. So this is an example from Senator Baldwin's office. They make it really easy. They have a nice form. Some of them have those forms, some of them don't. If you can't find the form, just call up. They will not blink an eye. They all have schedulers, and they know that people want them to go places, and you need to do it well in advance because they do get invited to a lot of stuff. And this is literally nuts and bolts for those of you coming to DC. It sounds silly, but shoes can ruin lobby days. You wear comfortable shoes. You want to look nice. You want to look professional, right? It's kind of like what you would wear to a business meeting. But do not wear like new shoes or very uncomfortable shoes. You will walk a lot. The buildings are big, and you will cover a lot of territory. And the buildings are full of very hard marble floors that are not good on your feet. So wear shoes you can be on your feet with a lot. Don't bring extra stuff. You got to go through security. So if you have a pocket knife, leave it in the hotel, leave it at home. Steel-toed shoes will set off those metal detectors. And we'll talk about this for folks coming to DC, but there are tips. Just ask people. There's cops everywhere. They will direct you. But the rule of thumb to remember is if you're meeting members of the House in their offices, do not go out to the street. Stay inside those buildings. They have tunnels underground that connect. And then the same thing over on the Senate, because every time you leave, you then have to go through security again, and it wastes a lot of time. So we'll cover all of that, but and also don't hesitate to ask people. Anybody wearing a badge, any cop, they will happily direct you because they know the buildings are confusing. So we'll talk about that when we're in town. So that's it. So I think we have a couple of questions that I will get to. So one question is from back in the beginning. Sending letters is one way to communicate with legislators. Can we send paper letters, or is it better to send them via email? That's a good question. One thing to think about is how fast, like how time sensitive it is. They read paper letters. But they have the security process for paper letters to get to them adds a lot of time. So if it's like, I am writing you this personal plea on a vote next week, I would email it, because there's a huge delay in what they I think they irradiate their mail in case of like terrorism problems, right? So it goes to an offsite place and they treat it, and then it has to be like aired out, and then they bring it in. So it's really slow sometimes when they get paper mail. So if you can email it, you can figure out, I'm sending it to Joe Smith, the agriculture staffer, and, I write my letter and attach it and say, this is a personal letter to you outlining this issue. If you're short on time, I would do that. And another question is our in-district meetings as powerful as Washington, D.C. office meetings? How much power do in-district staff have? It's a very good question. As a rule of thumb, the DC staff would tell you should always meet with the DC staff. There is kind of a rivalry that happens between the DC staff, of a senator or representative, and their in-district staff. Having said that, you can have a perfectly impactful meeting in the in-district level. And if it's a choice of doing an in-district meeting or doing nothing because you can't get to DC, I'm going to say in-district meeting. They do communicate, they do talk to each other, and if they're not, it's a really poorly run office. And actually for agriculture, I think is the issue where in-district meetings have the potential to be the most useful, because a lot of folks do have in-district agriculture staff. more so than other issues, right? Because I think they understand that people need to be out and about and closer to the ground, or they had people they really wanted as their ag staff who refused to move to DC. That happens as well. And it's in a well-run office, I think is well-run, where they're doing a good job. It is pretty common for me to go into a meeting in DC. I'm meeting with the agriculture staffer for that person, and they will put somebody from the district office on the phone so that they're all on the same page. There's quite a few offices that do that because they have agriculture people in those district offices. So it is valuable. If you ask DC people, they'll poo-poo it because they think they're the top of the heap because they're in DC, but it's definitely worth doing in the district, especially if there's no other way for you to get to DC, because it is a big trip. Let's see. Yeah, somebody want to see the calendar again. So it's a good question. I will do that in 1 second. Let's see if it's going to cooperate with me and look at the questions. There we go. So the question is kind of like timing, right? I know the time of year where members of Congress are most available is conveniently when most farmers are busy farming, right? So if we get that, we totally understand that. And it's not to say the only time you can meet with them is when they're in the district. You only can do it in the summer. And so the question is kind of like, what do we do about that if we're not available? And it's a really good question. And so groups like Organic Farmers Association, that's why I have this gig, right? Is to, in the intervening months, or in August or whenever, when farmers can't come to DC or they can't even do in-district meetings because they're busy farming, that's what we're doing the rest of the time. So absolutely, it's a good reason. That seasonal problem is a good reason to join OFA and make sure you're represented, or to join a regional farmers group, ideally both, to make sure that somebody the rest of the year is able to keep moving forward on this stuff, because we know you're busy and we know life gets crazy in the summer or whenever your growing season is. But having said that, so that's why we have these groups. We're happy to do that. We do it the year through. It's why we talk to you about your priorities, so I know what to go talk about when you guys are busy farming. But anything you could do, during the year. If you can't come to DC, you can't go to the in-district meeting, but if you could send a note, you could, pen a quick letter to the editor if you see them doing something wrong. Even those small things, because they know farmers are busy, do make a huge impact if it's from you. So that's what we need to do, is both, right? So we need to have whatever you all can have time to do, which we're happy to identify efficient ways to use your time. And ideally, we're doing it at the right time because we know your time is precious. And then folks like me and Kate getting in there and doing it, during business hours, the rest of the time when you guys are busy. So we need both. And with that calendar up, that is the cycle of these legislatures. That's how they do things. If you were looking at the calendar for a state legislature, you would see in most states, not all, but most states, they would knock off around Memorial Day and not be there all summer. And so you have more options to see them elsewhere, but they are also part-time. So, there's different, different calendars for different things. That was just to kind of show you that at any given point in the year, there's some time of the month they're probably home for a couple days at a time. And they are probably out and about. I also should mention, you don't have to go have a full-blown meeting to have them notice you, right? So again, I know it's terrible timing, but in some parts of the country, we have county fairs in August, or state fairs, right? Or the whole process of moving along, and they're getting out and about. And if it's an election year, you will see members of Congress there, and you're probably not going to sit down and have a 20-minute meeting with them, but maybe you have your talking point to be like, it's time for you to turn up the heat on USDA, make sure they're enforcing these organic standards. And they remember getting asked things, especially if it's not the same old, what are you doing on Medicare? What are you doing on Supreme Court Justice so-and-so? If it's something particular and you can do it in a minute while they're pressing the flesh, go for it. And we're going to think about that this year as well, because it is an election year. Are there quick, efficient things we can get out to all of you so that if you do run into them while they're cutting a ribbon or showing up at the fair or coming to somebody's field days at the university or whatever it is, that we have like quick things you can do there too, which we absolutely would take. Okay, let's see, I got one more question here. what happens if I schedule a Washington, D.C. office meeting with the agriculture aide? They're out that day and I end up meeting with some other staffer who's not covering agriculture. Should I try to follow up with the agriculture aide via email after the meeting, or should I feel confident that the message was relayed? That's a good question. Obviously, someone has done this before. Things happen, right? So you can have an appointment and it could be with, you know, whoever the agriculture person is, they're the right person to meet with and they wake up sick that morning, you know, and they don't come to work. You could have an appointment with the member of Congress because, you know, that office is like, yes, he really loves meeting with farmers. We're going to get you in there. And you wake up that morning and they change the schedule of the votes, or, you know, something else happens. So you meet with who's available. You don't storm out in the huff. You don't not do it. But yes, that would be like that scenario that you were scheduled to meet with the ag staffer. For some reason they weren't there and you met with maybe a junior person or somebody who covers environmental issues but not agriculture. Yeah, you meet with them. That would be a really good example of when, like I was talking about earlier, you kind of feel them out to be like, what's your familiarity level with organic? That's a particular challenge we have with organic. We're not just talking about agriculture, we're talking about a specific system with a lot of rules at USDA. So you might want to take those 2 minutes there and start laying that groundwork so they understand the rest of it. And that is a really good reason to follow up with the person you were originally scheduled to meet with. And maybe you do a phone call with them, you know, assuming that you're not in town for any more days, you're on the Hill one day only, you can't reschedule in person, might be a really good excuse to write them a note and be like, here's PDFs, you know, here's attachments of what I left with your colleague just to make sure you got them. I enjoyed talking to them. Would be great to talk to you too. Could we find a time for a phone call? Let's see. Okay, so let's see. We have a question about soil. So the question is, so there's a perception that communities feel like urban, you know, city soils are contaminated, even if they have a soil test. So that creates fear about, I guess, raising food in those places, right? So is it easier to push for organic farming for rural farms versus urban farming? Are there any wins for urban organic farming? That's a good question. Yes, I think that's right. There is a, you know, and in a lot of communities, it's justifiable that you need to look at that land use and figure out what could have happened in that soil and whether it's a good place to do it. I would say in terms of thinking about, you know, rural versus urban organic farming, a lot of offices, when we go in to talk about certified organic, you know, USDA sets the rules, we follow them, there's inspection and certifiers and, you know, all of this structure. If they're not familiar with that structure and they're not familiar with certified organic, sometimes they kind of lump it all together into kind of local food, sustainable agriculture, folks who are doing community gardens. And, you know, I don't know any organic farmer who is not supportive of those things, but they're not exactly the same, right? You know, somebody raising organic grains in the Midwest does not have the same needs as somebody doing community gardens in a neighborhood where maybe there was, you know, lead in soil. So we sometimes, if it's an office especially that's kind of not tracking these issues, they might kind of lump it all together and say, oh, you guys are over there on the side getting these special programs, and you may have to kind of pull those apart and explain who you are in that system versus maybe what they're assuming you are. In terms of, Kate might have other ideas, or we might be able to think of, maybe if you, I have my email on that last slide. If you email me, we might be able to get you some examples of kind of organic and urban. I think in previous farm bills, there's been some efforts to increase research and also extension for everybody and make sure it works at different levels. So I think that would be the place we would have to look for, like, are there wins for urban organic farming? A lot of it would be kind of in the technical assistance, research, extension, and outreach, and making sure that folks who are maybe doing urban farming are aware of organic methods. And then it's really an economic question of whether they choose to certify, whether they're in a supply chain that needs them to certify. But I think there's a lot of commonality probably in terms of like methods and practices that could benefit both communities. So in farm bills, we're seeing more attention to those issues. but it's still not proportional. And that's always one of the things we want to talk about is how do we get more resources into both those kinds of things as opposed to kind of the same old conventional agriculture that's dominated for so long. So that's it for the questions. I think we're probably about at time, right, Allie? Are we good?
We are exactly at 3 o'clock. We'll just
Okay.
give a moment as if anyone has a last minute question, feel free to type it in right now. But in the meantime, I just wanted to thank everyone who was able to join today, and we really appreciate Patty's dedication to this work and her involvement with OFA. We're really happy to have her on as our policy director. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we are a membership organization, so you can join as a farm member, a supporter member, or an organization. And we encourage all of you to be a part of this national movement. And more information about those different memberships can be found on our website. And we have also recorded this webinar, so we will be sending out a copy of it to those of you who attended today. And feel free to share with any of your friends or fellow farmer colleagues that might be interested as well in learning about this. So we thank you again for joining, and we hope that this information was helpful, and please feel free to reach out to Patty. Her contact information is on the screen right now, and she'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. So thanks, everyone.